The hospital corridors buzzed with the usual sounds: footsteps clicking against the tiled floor, the rhythmic beeping of machines, the hushed conversations of doctors and nurses making their rounds. Amidst this controlled chaos, Nurse Evelyn moved with effortless grace, her presence a source of comfort to those under her care. She had a way of making patients feel at ease, her voice gentle, her touch reassuring. "Don't worry, Mr. Carter," she whispered, tucking a warm blanket around the frail old man in room 208. "You'll be feeling better in no time." Her smile was soft, her tone filled with kindness. She had perfected this act, this role of the compassionate caregiver. And for years, no one ever questioned her. Why would they? Evelyn was the kind of nurse everyone trusted. Doctors relied on her efficiency, patients praised her attentiveness, and families were grateful for her warmth. She was always the first to volunteer for extra shifts, always available when someone needed help. She was the perfect nurse, but perfection is an illusion. Behind that angelic smile, behind the soft-spoken reassurances, there was something far more sinister at play. It had started small, barely noticeable, just little things that no one paid much attention to. A misplaced file, a slight mix-up in medication doses, a patient experiencing unexpected side effects. These incidents were brushed off as minor errors, the kind that happened in any busy hospital. After all, nurses were human too. But Evelyn never made mistakes. And yet, patients under her care were experiencing unexplained complications. Mrs. Thompson, a woman recovering from a routine surgery, suddenly developed a severe infection. Doctors were puzzled. It made no sense. Everything had been going well. The surgical wound had been healing perfectly. But overnight, she took a turn for the worse. Her fever spiked, her body trembled, and within days, she was fighting for her life. Evelyn had been by her side the whole time, holding her hand, whispering words of encouragement. "I'll take care of you," she had promised. But she hadn't. A few weeks later, a young man, barely 30, was admitted with a mild case of pneumonia. His prognosis was excellent. The doctors expected him to recover quickly. But then, something changed. His breathing grew labored, his oxygen levels dropped, and his condition spiraled downward at an alarming rate. No one could explain why. His family sat beside him, distraught, begging for answers. And there was Evelyn, once again, offering them comfort, telling them that everything would be okay. But everything wasn't okay. And the people closest to her, the other nurses, the doctors, the administration, began to notice that something wasn't right. It was the little details that started raising suspicions. A nurse would come in to administer medication, only to find that it had already been given by Evelyn. A patient's chart would show one set of vital signs, but when rechecked, the numbers didn't match. Dr. Patel, a senior physician, found himself puzzled over an unusual pattern. The patients experiencing complications had one common factor: they had all been under Evelyn's care. But that was ridiculous. Evelyn was one of their best nurses. If anything, she was the one always stepping up when others failed. And yet, the numbers didn't lie. A quiet murmur began to spread through the hospital. No one said it outright. Not yet. But the questions were being whispered in the break room, exchanged in hushed voices behind closed doors. "Have you noticed how many of Evelyn's patients are having complications? I thought it was just me. But yes, something's not adding up. Do you think she's—" No one finished the sentence. The idea itself was too horrifying to say out loud. But the doubts had been planted. Evelyn, of course, sensed it. She wasn't stupid. She had spent years perfecting her mask, crafting an image of absolute trustworthiness. And she knew that masks only stayed in place if they were carefully maintained. So she smiled wider. She was more helpful than ever, offering to cover extra shifts, staying late to ensure patients were well cared for. She played her role flawlessly, making sure no one could ever accuse her of anything. But deep down, she knew it was only a matter of time. She wasn't worried. After all, she had been doing this for years, and no one had caught her yet. The hospital always smelled the same, a mix of antiseptic, fresh linen, and the faint metallic scent of blood. It was a place where people came to heal, to find hope, to put their trust in the hands of those trained to care for them. But for some, this hospital was where their stories ended, and they all had one thing in common: Nurse Evelyn. It started with Mrs. Thompson, a 63-year-old woman recovering from minor surgery. She had been expected to go home within a few days. She was alert, smiling, even joking with her family. Everything was going well. But then, something changed. One morning, her breathing became shallow. Her pulse weakened. Her skin turned a shade too pale, as if life was slowly draining from her. Doctors rushed in, trying to stabilize her, but they couldn't understand what was happening. Her vitals had been normal the night before. Nurse Evelyn was the one who had last checked on her. "I was with her all night," she said, her voice soft, sorrowful. "She seemed fine when I left. No one questioned her. Why would they? Evelyn was one of the most dedicated nurses on staff. But Mrs. Thompson didn't make it. Her family was devastated, demanding answers. The doctors told them it was an unfortunate complication, one of those rare, unpredictable things that sometimes happened in medicine. Evelyn was there, comforting them, holding their hands. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she whispered, tears in her eyes. No one saw the way she wiped those tears away, just a little too quickly. Then came Mr. Lawson. He was only in his early 30s, admitted for a mild case of pneumonia. His condition was stable, and doctors expected him to make a full recovery. His wife sat by his bedside every day, reading to him, planning for the day he'd walk out of the hospital and return home. But that day never came. One night, Evelyn was assigned to his care. She administered his medication, adjusted his four, and spoke to him in that same calming voice she used with all her patients. She told him he was going to be fine, that she was taking good care of him. By morning, his condition had worsened. His oxygen levels dropped. His heart rate spiked, then plummeted. Panic spread through the hospital floor as doctors scrambled to save him. It was too late. His wife sobbed into his chest, demanding to know why. He had been improving. What had gone wrong? The medical team searched for an explanation, but nothing made sense. No infections. No sudden complications. No clear cause. Evelyn stood beside the grieving widow, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes," she whispered, "the body just gives up." The widow had no reason to doubt her. No reason to think that the nurse who had taken such good care of her husband had anything to do with his sudden, inexplicable decline. But others were starting to take notice. Dr. Patel, a senior physician, was troubled. In just a few months, too many patients had died unexpectedly, and all of them had been under Evelyn's care. He wasn't the type to believe in coincidences. He went back through the records, scanning each case with a growing sense of unease. He didn't have proof, not yet, but there was a pattern. And once you noticed a pattern, you couldn't unsee it. Then there was the night shift nurse, Maria, who had been working alongside Evelyn for years. She, too, had noticed something strange. Medications going missing. Charts being altered. Patients receiving treatments that weren't part of their prescribed care. One night, she walked into a patient's room and found Evelyn standing over the 4-drip, her back turned. The moment Evelyn heard Maria enter, she stiffened, then turned around, smiling. "Oh," Evelyn said lightly, just making a few adjustments. Maria smiled back, but something about the way Evelyn said it didn't sit right. She watched as Evelyn left the room, then stepped closer to the 4-bag. Her stomach twisted. The dosage had been increased, but not by the doctor. Her pulse quickened. It was just a mistake, right? Nurses made errors all the time. That's what she told herself. But the nagging voice in the back of her head refused to let it go. She decided to keep an eye on Evelyn. And then, one night, Maria found something that made her blood run cold. A patient, one who had been recovering well, suddenly stopped breathing. The emergency team rushed in, but he was gone before they could save him. Maria stood outside the room, watching as Evelyn comforted the family, just as she always did. But for the first time, Maria saw something else, a flicker of something in Evelyn's eyes. Not sadness, not sympathy, satisfaction. Maria's hands trembled as she clutched the clipboard to her chest. Something was very, very wrong. And she knew then she had to find out the truth. Because if she was right, then Nurse Evelyn wasn't just making mistakes. She was choosing her victims. Maria couldn't ignore the growing feeling of dread any longer. She had seen things, small, seemingly insignificant details that on their own could have been brushed off as coincidences. But together, They painted a terrifying picture. She had been a nurse for years, long enough to trust her instincts. And her instincts told her that something was deeply wrong with Nurse Evelyn. But how do you accuse someone who appears so perfect? Evelyn was adored by patients, trusted by doctors, and praised by the hospital administration. If Maria went to anyone with her suspicions, she risked looking paranoid, or worse, she could put herself in danger. Still, she couldn't just sit by and watch more people die. So, she started paying closer attention. The first red flag. One evening, Maria was finishing up paperwork when she overheard a conversation between Evelyn and another nurse. "I'll take care of it," Evelyn said smoothly, tucking a patient's file under her arm. "Are you sure?" the other nurse asked. "I thought Dr. Patel wanted to adjust his medication schedule." Evelyn smiled and faltered. "Don't worry about it. I've got it covered." Maria felt a chill run down her spine. Later that night, she discreetly checked that patient's chart. Just as she feared, the medication schedule had been changed, but the doctor hadn't made the adjustment. Evelyn had. And that patient, he died 2 days later. The second red flag. Maria knew she needed proof. So she started keeping notes, writing down everything she noticed, from missing medication doses to unexplained changes in patient records. Then one night, she decided to follow Evelyn. It was well past midnight, and most of the hospital was quiet. Maria waited until Evelyn disappeared into a patient's room and then crept closer. She peeked through the small window in the door, watching as Evelyn stood by the Ford drip. She wasn't checking the machine. She was adjusting something. Maria's breath hitched. What is she doing? A second later, Evelyn turned, and Maria quickly stepped back, pressing herself against the wall. She listened as Evelyn exited the room, her footsteps light, unhurried. Maria counted to 5 before slipping inside. The patient, a middle-aged man recovering from heart surgery, looked peaceful asleep. But something felt off. Maria glanced at the Ford drip. The medication bag had been swapped for a different one. She checked the label. This isn't his prescription. Her heart pounded as she stepped away. Evelyn was doing something to these patients, and she was getting away with it. The third red flag, a fatal mistake. A few days later, Evelyn made her first big mistake. Dr. Patel had ordered a change in medication for a recovering patient. Maria, now carefully monitoring everything Evelyn did, decided to check the records. She knew what should have been there, but it wasn't. The file had been tampered with. Maria's hands shook as she looked at the paperwork. This is it. This is the proof. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. It was time to go to the hospital administration. But as she turned to leave, she froze. Evelyn was standing at the doorway, watching her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt thick, charged with something unspoken but deadly. Then, Evelyn smiled. Not the warm, comforting smile she gave to patients. A different kind of smile. Cold. Knowing. Maria swallowed hard. "You've been busy," Evelyn said softly, stepping forward. Maria didn't move. She couldn't. Evelyn tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "I have to say, I'm a little disappointed in you, Maria. I thought we were on the same side." Maria clenched the file in her hands. "What side is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn sighed, almost as if she were tired. "You think you figured something out, don't you?" Maria took a step back. "I don't think, Evelyn. I know." Evelyn let out a soft laugh. "You know nothing." Maria's grip on the file tightened. "Patients are dying, Evelyn. And you're the reason." For the first time, Evelyn's smile faded. "That's a very serious accusation." "It's the truth." Evelyn's eyes darkened. "And what do you plan to do with this truth of yours?" Maria's breath came faster. She knew she was standing on the edge of something dangerous. Evelyn wasn't just a nurse who made mistakes. She was something else entirely. And Maria had just made herself a threat. The beginning of the end. That night, Maria slept with the file hidden in her locker, locked tight. She knew she had to be careful. She had to be smart. Evelyn had fooled everyone for years, and Maria wasn't going to be her next victim. The next morning, she walked straight to Dr. Patel's office. "Doctor," she said, placing the file in front of him, "we need to talk." Dr. Patel flipped through the pages, his expression growing more serious with each passing second. When he finally looked up, his face was pale. "Maria, if what you're saying is true," he shook his head. "We have a serious problem." Maria nodded. "We need to stop her." But Evelyn wasn't going down without a fight. And Maria had no idea just how far she was willing to go to keep her secrets buried. The hospital felt different now. The air was heavier, charged with an unspoken tension. Maria had done what she never thought she would. She had exposed Evelyn. But as she walked through the corridors, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go horribly wrong. Dr. Patel had promised to take action. He had seen the files, listened to her concerns, and agreed that they needed to investigate further. Maria had expected things to move quickly. A nurse harming patients. It was unthinkable. They should have called the authorities immediately. But the hospital administration was hesitant. "We don't want to make false accusations," they said. "Let's be sure." Be sure. How many more patients had to suffer before they were sure? Maria's frustration grew with each passing hour. Evelyn was still working, still tending to patients, still smiling that perfect smile. But something was different. Maria could see it now, the way Evelyn watched her, the way her eyes lingered just a little too long. "She knows." That thought sent a shiver down Maria's spine. Evelyn knew she was being watched. And if she had done all of this without a second thought, what would she do now that someone was standing in her way? The next few days were unbearable. Maria couldn't focus on anything else. She checked on patients obsessively, second-guessed every medication dose, and barely slept. She needed to be careful. She needed to be smart. But then, something happened that changed everything. A patient, a young woman who had been recovering well, suddenly coded in the middle of the night. The alarm screamed, doctors rushed in, but it was already too late. Maria stood frozen outside the room as they worked desperately to save her. Evelyn was in there, too. She was calm, composed, acting just as she always did in moments like this. But Maria saw something that no one else did, the way Evelyn's hands rested too still at her sides. Not in shock, not in panic, just waiting. When the doctor finally called it, Evelyn turned. Her eyes met Maria's, and then she smiled. Maria felt sick. That night, she knew she couldn't wait for the hospital to act. She needed real proof, something undeniable, something they couldn't ignore. She had to catch Evelyn in the act. She stayed late, pretending to be finishing paperwork, watching from the nurse's station as Evelyn moved through the halls. At first, it was just normal rounds. But then, around 2 a.m., Evelyn slipped into a patient's room. Maria followed. Her heart pounded as she approached the door, peering inside through the small glass window. Evelyn stood by the four, her back turned. Maria watched as she reached into her pocket, pulled something out, and leaned toward the drip. This was it. Maria didn't hesitate. She pushed the door open. "Evelyn!" Evelyn flinched but didn't turn right away. She stayed perfectly still for a moment before slowly facing Maria, her expression unreadable. "You're up late," she said smoothly. Maria took a step closer. "What are you doing?" Evelyn's lips curled into that soft, knowing smile. "My job." Maria's pulse thundered in her ears. "Step away from the four." Evelyn tilted her head, slightly. "You really think you figured it all out, don't you?" "I don't think," Maria said. "I know." Evelyn chuckled. "Then you also know that no one will believe you. They love me here. I'm the best nurse on this floor. You, on the other hand, well, you've always been a little too emotional, haven't you?" Maria clenched her fists. She wouldn't let Evelyn manipulate her. "I'm not the only one who sees it. Dr. Patel." "Dr. Patel is a coward," Evelyn interrupted. "And the hospital administration? They won't do anything unless they have undeniable proof." She took a step forward, lowering her voice. "And right now, all you have is a theory." Maria's breath hitched. Evelyn leaned in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But if you keep pushing, well, accidents happen, don't they?" The threat hung in the air, suffocating. Maria forced herself to stand her ground. She had been afraid for too long. "You're not getting away with this." Evelyn's smile faltered for the first time. Maria took that as her opening. She turned and walked straight to the nearest phone, dialing the hospital security line. "She's harming patients," Maria said urgently. You need to come to room 312. Now. Evelyn was still standing in the doorway, her face unreadable. For the first time, Maria saw something flicker in her eyes. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was calculation. Evelyn had been caught, but she was already thinking 2 steps ahead. Within minutes, security arrived. Dr. Patel was called. The patient Evelyn had been tampering with was immediately examined, and Maria made sure they checked everything. And there it was, the proof they needed. A medication that hadn't been prescribed, an altered dosage, something that could have led to another unexplainable death. Evelyn was silent as she was escorted from the room. She didn't argue. She didn't fight. She just looked at Maria and smiled. The next few hours were a blur. The police were called. An investigation was launched. As Maria sat in the break room, hands still trembling, she realized it was finally over. Or was it? Because as they took Evelyn away, she turned one last time, her eyes locking onto Maria's. "I'll see you around," she whispered. And just like that, she was gone. Maria felt the weight of her exhaustion settle into her bones. She had done the right thing. But Evelyn's words stayed with her. Would she really be gone? Or had Maria just made herself her next target?